So we're going to talk about fasteners and the various types there are and how they work and some of the other little things. So we're going to start out with actually washers. There's actually several different types of washers. I have them here to show you. So I'm still in package here. And what I want to show about them is what the purposes are for them. So let's look at this one right here to start with. This versus this one. Okay. So those are two what's known as flat washers. Those flat washers aren't identical. They are, although, the same size for the same bolt. Okay. This is known as a fender washer because it has a larger surface area. This is a standard flat washer. So, used for the same size bolt as this one. So it would protect the item from the head of the bolt or nut. This one's used to largen the force that comes down. So as you tighten the bolt, it will then spread the force downwards. So once again, fender washer, a standard flat washer. Okay. And then there's several types of what's known as lock washers. Lock washers are to help the bolt or nut to stay in place. Okay? So let's look at the different ones and then let's describe how they work. First one is your typical split lock washer. They're generally a lot thicker than a flat washer. And obviously they are cut and has a twist to it. This is a typical lock washer or cut washer. Then we have two different types of star washers. We have this type, which is an internal star washer, and an external star washer. Okay, so those are the different types of lock washers. Now, those lock washers are meant not to, and a lot of people get mistaken, is if I were to put the bolt here, that they think that this or that's going to cut into the bolt. Sorry, that this or that is going to cut into the bolt when you tighten it. Well, see, I'm tightening this way, so it's not cutting in at all. So if I were to loosen it, that's where it gets it, but it's not to prevent it from that. What it actually does is it adds what's known as preload. So as you tighten, this will get squished, okay, and then it will push upwards away from there, adding tension onto the bolt or onto the nut to hold it away from it, which will then force it into its threads. The lock washers are made to add preload or tension against the bolt to push it out, which it's not doing. It's just locking the threads together into a bolt and nut or into a fastener. So that's what a lock washer, split lock washer, and the stars do the same thing. They do have a gripping teeth to help prevent it from moving, but once again, it's not made to do that. As you can see here, those teeth aren't even coming in contact with the head of this bolt. Okay, so it is to grip into the material there on these star washers, but once again, it is adding tension to the bolt. So those are your washers we've just learned about. Let's go ahead and talk about bolts since I have them. Now there is lots of different types of bolts. We have this bolt. They all kind of look the same. But each one is actually slightly different. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a closer look at these bolts and how they function. So right here is just a standard bolt. Nothing fancy about it. There we go. Okay, but this is a grade 8 bolt, meaning it's a strong bolt. Okay, right here this is a grade 2 bolt. And then I have here is a grade 5 bolt. Grade's talking about how strong the bolt is. So these two bolts, as you can see, have the same thread length, same length of shank. It actually has the same bolt head size, so you would use the same wrench. But this one is weaker than this one, and it's not because of the color. It's the material. So what I'm talking about is tensile strength. So when you tighten this down, it can only get tightened so much before it will break. This one will go further. Now, how do I know which one is stronger? And it won't be because of the color. And it's from the heads of the bolts. So let's get those in focus there. So let's go with the weakest one first. If we look at this one, there is no markings other than the callouts of this bolt. Okay? So those callouts is just for packaging. It's flat. Okay? A grade 5 bolt will have 3 lines. Okay? And then a grade 8 bolt will have 6 lines. So if you want to know the grade, you just add 2 to the number of lines you see. Okay? So that is what's known as an SAE bolt or a standard bolt. So now let's look at metric bolts. I have 2 of them here. Okay? Now metric doesn't do lines on them. They actually put numbers to them. So what I have here is a grade 8.8 bolt. Okay? And then what I have here is a 10.9 bolt. This one's a stronger bolt. Okay? Same head, same. There is a difference in threads, and we're going to talk about that in a second, and it's different lengths. But this bolt is stronger even though it's shorter. It's because the material it's made with is stronger. Okay? So that's the basics on bolts. So now let's look at thread, or known as thread pitch. In bolts, there's known as fine thread and coarse thread. So here is fine thread, meaning that the threads are placed closer together. This is known as a coarse thread. Those are further apart. This is on an SE or a standard bolt. Metric does the same thing. This is a fine bolt. This one is a coarse thread bolt. They look a lot the same, but there is a difference. So you have to be aware of that. Okay? So, once again, those are all the different types of bolts that we have. Now, I want to go over one quick thing is about measuring the bolt. On measuring the bolt, it is not measured at the head. It's not what wrench you would use. It is measured at what's known as the shank, outer part, or the from thread to thread. That is how you measure this bolt. Okay? So this is the diameter of the bolt and the length of the bolt. Okay? That's how you make a measurement of a bolt. All right, so let's go on into some of the more peculiar fasteners. All right, so let's start with what's known as a counter pin. I have 2 examples here. I have a really extreme example right here. This is known as a counter pin. It is a piece of metal that comes along. It has a flat edge generally on one side or the inside, and it comes around. And what you do is you would split these between what's known as a castle nut. This is more what you would typically see as a counter pin. A little smaller, but once again, the metal looped back on itself, and then you meant to bend it. That way it would fit. Okay, so those are counter pins. And then we have what's called an E-clip. This is an E-clip. Donna makes an E. Okay, so this slips around generally like a shaft that has a groove in it to help hold it in place so that it doesn't slide back and forth. So an E-clip. All right. And then we have just two more that I want to review. There is a lot more fasteners, but there is just the ones that we would typically see in power equipment. The next one is a hitch pin. Okay, generally you'll have a hole in a bolt or another form of a fastener. This would slip in and then would lock in on this little bulge in here to help prevent it. And what's nice is you can remove it and then tighten things up. So this is a nice hold in place. So let me just put them up here. Powder pen, hitch pin, then the E-clip. Right, and there's just one more I want to talk about, and that's this one sitting right here. This is called a key. Okay, this is to help locate various parts. So here's a brake for a go-kart. And what we have here is a key way. And then the shaft for the axle would sit there. And to prevent this from sliding around on the axle so it would spin, you would put a key in here. And then that key would go into the groove of the axle to hold it in place to prevent it from spinning. Okay, so those are the various types of holders we have there. Now let's go on to our next one, and that is nuts. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about nuts, which is our last fastener that we're going to talk about. Okay, so we have several different types of nuts that we're going to talk about today. Get them all out here. All right, and then we're going to learn about which each one and special about them or not special. So that way we're ready to understand the use of them if we are to use them once and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get closer and let's take a look at this. First one I'm going to talk about is just a standard nut. Now, once again, because you can have a bolt and coarse thread or fine thread, you would also have nuts that are in fine thread or coarse thread. Okay, this one's a coarse thread nut. And as you can see, there it threads to this bolt. Okay, so that's just a typical nut. So let's go ahead and let's go into some other ones. Let's go to this one, which is a flared nut. It's kind of obvious by the look of it. Kind of has a built-in washer to help spread the load on it. So this is a flare nut. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is this one. I like this one. It's called a wing nut. So this way you can spin it on. Now, I don't think it's the same size. Let's just check. It is. So the idea of a wing nut is to be able to fasten it faster. So if you have a long thread to go through, so if you have a part that has to slide down, the wing nuts are nice because they can slide on. And also for something that is serviceable, generally you'll see it on your air filters of your power equipment. So this is a wing nut, it has little wings. Followed by, let's go with this one. This is called a nylon locker. What happens is there's a ring of plastic sitting right inside here that has no threads cut in it. Here on the nut, it has threads. I don't think I have the right bolt for that one. Nope. Okay, so as the bolt comes into it and then it gets contact with that plastic ring there, it will cut threads into that plastic ring, which then will hold the bolt into place. So it's a nylon locker. These are one-time use. Okay, followed by, let's go with this one. So much like this, just a typical nut. This is also a pretty typical nut. It's just called a square nut. And it's squared. Okay, so that one right there. We just have two more to go about. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this one. This has generally two names. This is actually a lug nut, or what's known, there's another one called an acorn nut. You can get confused. Acorn nuts are closed on the top, so don't let that get you confused. So a lug nut has a taper in it, so that when it tightens against a wheel, it will center the hole on the stud. So it's a lug nut. You'll see that on your various power equipment, your ATVs and stuff. The last one I'm going to talk about is a castle nut. Now the castle nut has grooves cut into it so that you can slide a cotter pin. Now this one's too small for it, but the bolt would have a hole, and then you would slide this cotter pin through there. So if I were to take this big one, it won't fit in there. It would slide through, and then I would bend these tabs back, and it would prevent the bolt from sliding out. Okay, so let's go ahead and review those last few as I clear the desk here. So, basic nut, basic square nut, flared nut, lug nut, wing nut, nylon locker, and castle nut. So there we go. That's all of the fasteners that we will review within the small vehicle repair class. There's lots more fasteners out there, but within the power equipment industry, these are generally the basic ones that you will learn to use. Okay, and then we're going to learn about the tools that it takes to manipulate or remove or install these various things in our next module. Thank you for joining me.